Imagine standing on the walls of a lonely fortress, knowing that everything you love, your home, your family, your entire country, is about to be erased. You look out across the horizon, and the world has turned black. Not from clouds. Not from smoke. But from an army so vast it swallows the landscape. 40,000 soldiers of the Ottoman Empire, the most powerful military force on earth, marching toward you, and only 2,000 defenders trapped behind crumbling medieval walls. No reinforcements. No escape. No chance, at least, not according to the world. And yet, for 39 days, this tiny garrison did the impossible. They held. They bled. They burned. They fought in the tunnels beneath their own feet. Women poured boiling oil from the ramparts. Children carried stones to the walls as cannon fire shook the earth. Farmers, priests, blacksmiths, widows, and soldiers stood shoulder to shoulder and faced an empire that had never failed to take a fortress. History should have forgotten them. Instead, they stopped an invasion that could have changed the fate of Europe. This is the real story of Eger, 1552, the siege where ordinary people made an empire. True Crime Cartel Originals. Before we dive into today's story, I've got one small favor to ask. If you love deep, real stories like this, tap the like button, hit subscribe, and drop a comment below telling us which city you're watching from. It helps more than you know, and it allows us to keep bringing you stories no one else dares to tell. Now, let's get into the story. The dawn of September 9th, 1552 crept over the highlands with a pale, icy stillness, the kind that made every breath visible and every sound unnervingly sharp. But the silence that hung over Eger Castle that morning would not last long. Captain István Dobó, alone atop the eastern wall, lifted a brass telescope to his eye. His heartbeat quickened. At first, he thought the lens was smudged, the horizon looked wrong. Blurred. Darkened. As if a great shadow had fallen over the plain. Then he understood. The horizon wasn't dark because something blocked the light. It was dark because an army was swallowing the earth. A living, moving, advancing black tide. Horsemen in shimmering armor. Infantry marching in perfect formation. Endless banners of crimson and gold snapping in the wind. And behind them, lumbering forward like dragons forged of bronze, came the siege cannons, weapons large enough to shatter walls and silence cities. Dobó drew a slow breath. The impossible had arrived. Behind him, footsteps echoed against the stone steps, quick, uneven, panicked. Lieutenant Ferenc Sisi, young, breathless, and pale, hurried to the captain's side. "Captain," he stared at the horizon. His voice failed. "Is that all of them?" Dobó lowered the telescope slowly, the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like iron. "Yes," he said. "The Ottomans have come." Sisi swallowed hard. "What do we do?" The question was too innocent. Too honest. In the courtyard below, Eger struggled to resemble a fortress rather than a frightened town. Women hauled ammunition crates. Blacksmiths hammered dents from old helmets. Priests hurried children toward the inner keep. Refugees, hundreds of them, clustered beside wagons, clutching their belongings and their fears. Dobó looked at Sisi, then back at his people. "We hold," he said. "We hold until we can't hold anymore. And if they break through..." He tightened his gauntlet. "We make them pay for every stone." The lieutenant nodded, though his hands trembled. Dobó walked along the battlements, his gaze fixed on the approaching sea of soldiers. Somewhere out there, under banners bearing the crescent moon, rode Ali Pasha, the undefeated Ottoman commander. A veteran of Persia. A master of siege warfare. A man who turned fortresses into tombs. Eger was next. But Dobó had spent 3 years preparing for this moment. Reinforcing walls with earth. Stockpiling supplies. Drilling militias. Training civilians. The country had retreated too many times already. If Eger fell, northern Hungary could collapse. He reached the southern bastion. Officers gathered around him, silent, waiting, hungry for orders, terrified to hear them. That, Dobó said, pointing toward the black mass on the horizon, is not an army. It is an empire. And it believes we will flee before its shadow. He faced his men fully. But this is our land. Our home. If they want it, let them try to take it. A murmur rippled through the ranks, fear, yes, but also something stronger. Defiance. Outside the walls, the Ottoman host moved with surgical precision. Drums thundered. Officers barked commands. Tens of thousands of tents unfolded like a sea of red and gold fabric. Artillery crews measured distance, aligned their cannons, and prepared the powder. The valley vibrated with the weight of an empire assembling for war. Inside Eger, every heart beat faster. Dobó shouted orders. All civilians to the keep. Soldiers to the walls. Hold until my command, no one fires early. Runners sprinted. Children were carried to cover. Muskets were primed. Cauldrons were filled. The entire fortress became a hive of motion and fear. Then, suddenly, the Ottoman front line stilled. The artillery commander stepped forward. Raised his arm. The breath of the entire garrison seemed to halt. Steady! Dobó roared across the walls. A heartbeat passed. And then... boom! The first Ottoman cannon fired. The ground shook. Stone dust rained from the battlements. Children screamed. Soldiers flinched. The sky filled with smoke and terror. The Siege of Eger had begun. The first Ottoman cannonball smashed into Eger's outer wall with a thunderous crack that shook dust from the ceiling of the chapel and sent a vibration up through every stone of the fortress. Men instinctively ducked. Women gasped. Even Dobó felt the tremor in his bones. The siege had begun, violently, decisively, and with a message the Ottomans had sent thousands of times before. We will break your walls. We will break your will. We will break you. Within minutes, the entire valley filled with smoke. Ottoman artillery crews had rehearsed this many times. They moved like extensions of the cannons themselves, measuring powder, loading stone balls the size of barrels, ramming them home, adjusting aim, and firing again. Boom! 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 The rhythm was relentless. Inside the castle, the first hour passed in a haze of dust and shock. By the second hour, the defenders understood this was not a warning. This was annihilation, delivered one explosive heartbeat at a time. Men rushed to reinforce weakened walls. Women formed bucket chains to carry water to the battlements. Children covered their ears as bits of stone rained down from above. And through the chaos, Captain Dobó walked the walls, calm, focused, absorbing every detail of the unfolding nightmare. The Ottomans had placed their heaviest guns on the southeastern ridge, the one angle where the medieval walls were thinnest. Dobó cursed under his breath. He had strengthened that section with earthworks, yes, but earth could only absorb so much punishment before giving way. The bombardment intensified. For the first time, a crack zigzagged across one of the parapets. Reinforce that section. Dobó bellowed. Stone, timber, anything you can carry. Men scrambled, but even as they worked, another cannonball struck, sending shards of stone whistling through the air like jagged arrows. A defender fell, neck sliced open. Another collapsed with his chest crushed under debris. War leaves no gentle introductions. By midday, the Ottomans adjusted their range and began targeting the southern bastion as well. Their goal was clear: open multiple fractures and force the defenders to spread thin. But the people of Eger refused to panic. On the northern wall, 15-year-old Mihai Sisi, Lieutenant Ferencz's younger brother, carried stones to the repair crews despite his arms shaking from exhaustion. In the courtyard, women shredded linen to make bandages while others boiled water for the wounded. Blacksmiths worked in a frenzied rhythm, repairing shattered armor plates and broken spearheads as fast as they arrived. Every person became part of the fortress. Even the refugees who had arrived days before. One of them, Eva Sisi, a widow with fire in her eyes, moved tirelessly between the walls and the keep, helping carry ammunition and food to the defenders. She had never fired a musket before the siege, but she learned quickly. Eger had no bystanders. Meanwhile, Dobó studied the Ottoman patterns. Their artillery was rotating fire between three major points, an attempt to find the weak seam in the fortress's defenses. The Ottomans were experts at this. They had perfected siege warfare. Their engineers knew exactly how to collapse walls by undermining or pulverizing foundations. But Eger was not like other fortresses. It had something far more dangerous than thick walls. It had people who refused to surrender. That first night, as the bombardment slowed and darkness draped over the valley, Eger's defenders moved by torchlight, repairing, hauling, bracing. No one slept. The ground trembled long into the night from residual shockwaves. Dobó ordered all fires extinguished except torches on the walls. He wanted the Ottomans to see movement, to see silhouettes, to see defiance. He wanted them to know. We are not afraid of the dark. But fear was there, of course it was. A siege is not a place free of terror. It is a place where terror becomes a companion, a shadow you never lose sight of. Still, inside Eger Castle, something else burned alongside fear. Resilience. The Ottomans did not let the defenders rest long. At dawn on the second day, the artillery resumed its merciless rhythm. By the third day, the ground inside Eger felt alive, constantly vibrating, constantly shifting. Small cracks became large fractures. Fractures became gaps. Gaps became potential breaches. Dobó knew the moment was coming. On the fourth day, Ottoman cannons finally tore a significant hole in the outer wall, 10 meters wide, stones blasted outward like shattered teeth. The defenders reacted instantly. Storage crates, wooden beams, furniture, anything they could find, they piled into the gap, forming a makeshift barricade. It wouldn't stop a full assault. But it would slow one. And slowing the enemy was survival. By the fifth day, the Ottomans stopped aiming solely at walls. Their cannons shifted target to the defenders themselves. The intent was clear. Break their bodies. Break their spirit. Break the will to fight. A stray shot struck the courtyard, sending shards into a group of women preparing food. One died instantly. 2 more were dragged to the makeshift hospital in the chapel. Eva Sisi worked among the injured, blood staining her sleeves, her face grim but unbroken. This was no longer a battle of armies. It was a battle of endurance. That evening, Dobó gathered his officers. Their armor was dented, their faces gray with dust and exhaustion. Hold the walls, he told them. They will try an assault soon. They want to test our strength. Make them regret it. And though no one said it out loud, they all knew. The first assault would decide if Eger stood a chance at all. Because the Ottomans were preparing something. Something enormous. Something deadly. The defenders felt it in the air. And on the morning of the sixth day, their suspicions were confirmed. Ottoman drums began to beat. Slow. Rhythmic. Certain. The kind of rhythm that announces only one thing. The assault is coming. The Ottoman drums rolled across the valley like approaching thunder, slow, deep, deliberate. Each beat vibrated through the stones of Eger Castle, rattling windows and tightening every muscle inside the fortress. To the defenders, the sound felt less like music and more like a warning. Prepare yourselves. Death is coming. Captain István Dobó strode along the southern wall, scanning the valley as the echoes grew louder. The sun had barely climbed above the ridge, and already heat shimmered over the Ottoman campfires. Tens of thousands of soldiers were on their feet, forming ranks with clinical precision. The movement looked like the shifting of a single vast organism. By the time Dobó reached the bastion, the valley was alive with motion. Janissaries marched in straight lines. Sipahi cavalry formed flanking units on the far edges. Behind them, auxiliary troops, Azabs and Akinji light infantry, carried ladders, hooks, and siege tools. Farther back, smoke curled from the artillery lines as engineers prepared to fire another barrage to soften the walls before the assault. Dobó drew in a long breath. Everything he had feared in the first week of siege was now taking shape. Today, Eger would face its first full-scale assault. And if they failed? The Ottomans would pour through the breach, slaughtering everything inside the fortress. Behind him, defenders lined the battlements, soldiers, farmers, monks, students, blacksmiths, even young boys barely old enough to lift a spear. Some had blood on their hands from repairing wounds in fortifications through the night. None had slept. Dobó raised his voice. Today is the day they test our strength. Today is the day they expect us to break. But we will not break. Not now. Not ever. A ripple of defiance moved down the line. Below, the beating of drums quickened. The first wave was coming. The assault began with fire. Ottoman cannons roared almost simultaneously, launching shards of stone and clouds of dust into the sky. The walls shook. A parapet cracked. Men gripped their weapons tighter as debris rained around them. "Hold!" Dobó shouted as another thunderous blast struck the southern bastion. Behind the artillery barrage came the terrifying hiss of rockets, primitive but deadly Ottoman incendiaries. They streaked across the air trailing smoke, exploding against the walls with gouts of flame. Defenders ducked, covering their heads. One rocket struck a wooden platform, igniting it instantly. Volunteers scrambled with buckets of sand to smother the fire while more fell around them. Then came the signal, a long, piercing Ottoman horn. And the first wave advanced. Azab infantry surged forward, shouting battle cries that echoed against the cliffs. They carried shields, hooks, axes, and siege ladders. Their goal was simple: overwhelm the defenders through sheer numbers. The ground trembled as thousands rushed the walls. Arrows darkened the sky. Stones from slingshots peppered the battlements. A few defenders cried out as the first volley struck flesh. Dobó bellowed. "Archers, loose!" A storm of Hungarian arrows descended on the charging mass. Men fell. Others stumbled and kept running. Their momentum was terrifying. The first siege ladders slammed against the walls. Hooks clamped onto parapets. Ottoman infantry began to climb. The battle transformed instantly into chaos. Defenders stabbed downward with spears. Ottomans hacked upward with axes. Boiling water and oil poured from cauldrons, splashing onto armor and bare skin, sending shrieks into the morning air. Dobó swung his sword, severing hands that reached the top of the ladder. Ferenc Sisi fought beside him, face streaked with soot, shouting orders to the younger soldiers. For every ladder pushed back, 2 more took its place. And then something worse began. Ottoman sappers approached the weakened southeastern wall, men carrying barrels of gunpowder. Their intent was unmistakable: blow open a breach large enough to march an army through. Dobó's blood ran cold. "Marksmen," he roared. "Sappers at the southeastern wall. Take them down." Gunshots cracked from muskets resting on sandbags. Several sappers fell, barrels exploding prematurely. But others pressed forward. Inside the wall, defenders rushed to reinforce the compromised section. Men shoved stones, beams, barrels, anything, to plug the narrowing gap. But the Ottomans kept coming. And then the first explosion hit. The blast sent a shockwave through the fortress, knocking men from their feet. A hole opened in the wall, small, but real. Through it, Ottoman infantry surged, forcing the defenders into close combat. It became hand-to-hand carnage. Swords clashed. Axes swung. Blood sprayed across stone. Dobó threw himself into the melee, fighting like a man possessed. Every second felt like the line between victory and annihilation. Despite the chaos, something remarkable happened. The defenders began to push back. One ladder toppled under the weight of 10 climbing soldiers. Another snapped when 2 blacksmiths swung hammers at its base. Women hurled stones from above. A priest wielded a spear with trembling determination. The assault slowed. Then stalled. Then, miraculously, collapsed. By midday, the Ottomans pulled back from the wall, dragging the wounded with them. The drums signaled retreat. For a moment, only breathing and the crackle of dying fires filled the air. Dobó, covered in blood and dust, leaned on the battlement and scanned the valley below. Hundreds of Ottoman bodies littered the slopes. But he knew the truth. This was just a test. The real assault was yet to come. The defenders had survived the first wave. But the price had been steep: 40 dead, more than 100 wounded, and a wall barely holding together. And below them, the Ottomans were already regrouping. They had measured Eger's strength. Next time, they would attack with fury. And next time, the defenders might not hold. Dobó whispered to himself, "God give us strength for what comes next." Because the siege was no longer simply war. It was now a contest of endurance. Of will. Of desperation. And both sides knew. This was only the beginning. The battlefield fell eerily silent after the Ottomans withdrew, silent except for the groans of the wounded, the crackle of smoldering wood, and the faint, distant rhythm of the enemy drums beating somewhere deep inside their sprawling camp. The defenders leaned against the walls, chests heaving, arms trembling, blood from their wounds mixing with dust and sweat. Captain István Dobó surveyed the carnage below. The slopes were littered with broken ladders, dropped shields, and bodies. A grim testament to Eger's first victory. But Dobó's face did not soften, nor did pride lighten his expression. He knew the truth. The first assault was only a probe. The real devastation was coming. Behind him, the fortress slowly came back to life. Medics, mostly women armed with herbal knowledge and iron wool, rushed to the wounded. Priests whispered prayers over the dying. Men reinforced damaged walls with beams, rubble, and sandbags, working with frantic speed. Children carried buckets of water, stones, and bandages, refusing to remain idle. Dobó descended from the battlements just as Lieutenant Ferenc Sisi approached him, limping slightly, his cheek cut and bleeding. "They're regrouping," Ferenc said. "The drums haven't stopped." "I know," Dobó replied. Ali Pasha is calculating. The next assault will not be ladders alone. Cannons? Ferenc asked. Cannons, and fire, and something worse. Ferenc nodded, swallowing hard. He already knew what worse meant. Mines. Tunnels. Explosives beneath the walls. The Ottomans had used them across Europe, with devastating effect. Tunneling crews, skilled, silent, deadly, dug beneath fortress foundations, packed chambers with gunpowder, and blew entire sections of wall skyward. If they did it here, who could survive such an explosion? Dobó walked toward the chapel, where the wounded lay in rows. He paused at a young soldier whose leg had been crushed by falling stone. The boy's eyes fluttered open. Captain, did we win? We held, Dobó told him softly. And we will keep holding. The boy smiled faintly before exhaustion pulled him back into unconsciousness. Dobó straightened. He would not let this fortress fall. Not while he breathed. But the Ottoman camp was already stirring for the next phase of the siege. By late afternoon, smoke rose from multiple points in the valley, not from cooking fires, but from engineering posts. Ottoman sappers began mapping the best locations to dig their tunnels. Engineers placed flags and markers. Surveyors took measurements. Eger's defenders watched nervously. Ferenc approached Dobó again, this time with Gergely Bornemissza, a young and brilliant artilleryman with sharp eyes and the mind of an inventor. Bornemissza held a crude sketch in his hands. We think they're preparing 3 tunnels, he said. Dobó frowned. 3? Bornemissza nodded. One under the southeastern bastion, one near the northern slope, and a third beneath the old chapel wall. Dobó felt his stomach tighten. If they blow those at once. They won't, Bornemissza interrupted calmly. They want to break one section cleanly, then pour inside and overwhelm us. But we think we can counter-tunnel. Counter-tunneling. A desperate, dangerous tactic. Digging tunnels of their own to intercept the enemy underground. Dobó considered it. How many miners do we have? Bornemissza exhaled. Enough to try. Without hesitation, Dobó nodded. Begin immediately. And so, as the sun dipped toward the western hills, Eger became a fortress above ground and a battleground below it. Defenders lit torches, grabbed pickaxes, and descended into the earth. The air became thick with dust and heat as men clawed their way through soil, praying to reach the Ottoman tunnels before it was too late. Every strike of a pickaxe, every scoop of dirt, became a fight against unseen death. Hours passed. Then, a faint scratching. A muffled voice. A distant thud. The Ottomans were beneath them. Silence. Bornemissza whispered. The Hungarian miners pressed their ears to the dirt. The enemy was close, far too close. Bornemissa's eyes sharpened. Prepare the smoke pots. They shoved rough clay pots filled with noxious materials into the tunnel. When lit, the pots released thick, choking fumes. Moments later, the first underground confrontation began, not with swords, but with smoke. Hungarian miners ignited the pots and rolled them toward the Ottoman tunnel. The hiss of smoke filled the narrow passage. Men coughed. Dirt vibrated as the Ottomans scrambled backward, choking, abandoning their dig. It worked. The first tunnel was stopped. But the Ottomans had 2 more. And above ground, the bombardment resumed. By the 3rd day after the assault, the Ottomans unleashed a new terror. Flaming projectiles. Their artillery crews began launching fireballs, bundles of tar-soaked rags and resin, over the walls. They burst into flames upon impact, igniting rooftops and wooden walkways. Eger turned into a patchwork of fire and smoke. Women ran with sand. Men beat flames with wet cloths. At one point, the roofs of 3 nearby buildings caught fire simultaneously. Volunteers formed bucket chains that stretched from the well to the burning structures. Dobó personally climbed a ladder to help extinguish flames licking up the side of a tower. Heat burned his face. Sparks stung his eyes. But he did not retreat. On the 4th day, morale hung by a thread. Food grew scarce. Water was rationed. Sleep became a luxury few experienced. Every wall bore scars of bombardment. The Ottomans continued digging. The defenders continued counter-digging. Fire rained from the sky. Smoke filled the air. Screams echoed through the night. Yet still, the walls held. The people endured. They refused to break. Dobó gathered his officers one evening as the sun bled red into the horizon. "We have survived the first assault," he said. "We have stopped their first tunnels. We have endured fire and bombardment. But they will not stop. They will grow more ruthless. We must prepare for their greatest blow." Ferenc asked, "What will it be, Captain?" Dobó looked toward the enemy camp, where thousands of torches flickered like stars fallen to earth. "The storm," he said quietly. "And the storm is coming soon." Night settled over the valley like a suffocating cloak. The fires from the flaming projectiles had finally been contained, but smoke still lingered in the air, twisting around the towers like restless ghosts. The defenders slept where they fell, beside cauldrons, atop stairs, leaning against walls, exhaustion claiming them deeper than any bed ever could. But Captain István Dobó did not sleep. He stood alone on the southern bastion, staring at the Ottoman camp below. It glowed with thousands of torches, a constellation of sparks spread across the valley floor. He observed the movement, engineers pacing, officers pointing, cavalry units shifting positions, gunners cleaning the cannons, rows upon rows of tents being tightened against the night wind. Something was changing. The air had a weight to it. A tension. A terrible purpose. Dobó felt it in his bones. "The storm," he murmured under his breath. "This is the calm before it." By dawn, the defenders felt it too. The valley was strangely quiet. No cannon fire. No rockets. No tunneling sounds. Only the faint tapping of metal on wood as Ottoman troops assembled long ladders, shields, and rams. Then the drums began. Not the slow, steady rhythm of the first assault. This was faster. Louder. Ferocious. The defenders jolted awake. Smoke rose from the Ottoman lines as artillery crews positioned their heaviest weapons at new angles. Thousands of infantry formed in dense columns. And farther back, behind the janissaries, massive siege rams, thick beams of timber capped with iron, were wheeled into position. The storm had arrived. Dobó raised his sword, pointing it toward the valley. "To the walls," he shouted. "This is the day they try to break us." Defenders scrambled to position. Women carried water and ammunition. Children, wide-eyed but unyielding, delivered stones and arrows. Blacksmiths dashed along the walls with repair tools. The entire fortress became a living, beating organism, tired, battered, but fiercely alive. Then, without warning, the sky erupted. Ottoman cannons fired in perfect unison. Boom! 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 The ground shook violently. Portions of the outer wall gave way. Arrows followed the cannon barrage, so many that the air looked like it had sprouted thorns. Then came the rockets. Flaming arcs streaked across the sky, trailing smoke, crashing into roofs, towers, and walkways. Defenders dove for cover. Smoke flooded everything. It was as if the sky itself were falling. Through the smoke, the Ottoman infantry advanced. Azabs in the front. Janissaries behind them. Sipahi cavalry flanking on the far edges, ready to exploit any breach. The assault columns moved with terrifying discipline, shields raised, ladders carried, chanting war cries that rose above the thunder of drums. The defenders responded with everything they had. Archers loosed volley after volley. Musketeers fired from behind sandbags. Rocks were hurled down. Barrels of sand were dumped onto climbing soldiers to blind and disorient them. The first siege ladders slammed into the walls. Dobó, standing at the southern bastion, swung his sword, severing the rope of a ladder before the enemy could climb it. Ferenc Sisi fought beside him, hacking at enemy hands trying to grasp the parapets. A ladder to their right crashed down, taking with it 5 Ottoman soldiers who fell screaming to the rocks below. But the Ottomans were endless. For every ladder destroyed, 2 more rose. Defenders poured boiling water and oil onto the climbers, but still they ascended, their boots slipping on blood-slick stone as they clawed upward with terrifying determination. Janissaries reached the top. The screams began. Sword against scimitar. Shield against shield. Man against man. The walls of Eger became a slaughterhouse. Dobó fought like a man possessed. He parried a Janissary strike, countered with a crushing blow, then pivoted to protect a wounded soldier. Ferenc shouted for reinforcements as the enemy surged up a ladder at terrifying speed. But the walls were only half the battle. Because deep beneath the earth, the Ottomans were preparing something devastating. And Bornemissza heard it first. He rushed to Dobó, breath ragged. "They're igniting a mine," he shouted. "Under the old chapel wall." Dobó's heart dropped. "Get every man off that section now." But the warning came too late. A deafening explosion tore through the fortress. The ground beneath the chapel wall heaved like a living creature. The stone cracked. Then erupted. A huge plume of earth and debris shot into the sky as the explosion ripped open the wall, sending defenders flying like broken dolls. The Ottomans roared in triumph. A breach had opened. Through the smoke and dust, the assault column charged toward the gap. Dobó sprinted toward the breach, gathering every defender he could find, soldiers, miners, even wounded men who could still hold a spear. The gap in the wall was wide enough for a dozen men to enter at once. The Ottomans surged. Dobó met them head-on. Swords clashed. Bodies collided. Men screamed. The dust was so thick it turned the battle into a nightmare of shadows and steel. The defenders formed a desperate human wall, blocking the breach with their bodies when stone had failed them. A Janissary nearly cut Ferenc's head from his shoulders. Dobó intercepted the blow, driving his sword into the attacker's chest. Bornemissza arrived with improvised explosives, small clay bombs packed with powder and shrapnel. He lit the first fuse and hurled it into the densest part of the Ottoman column. The explosion sent bodies flying. For a moment, the enemy faltered. Then the defenders pushed. Every man, woman, and youth who could stand joined the effort. They shoved stones, barrels, crates, and timber into the breach, forming a makeshift barricade with bleeding hands. The fighting lasted for hours. Finally, slowly, painfully, the Ottomans began to retreat. Their assault had failed. Eger still stood. Barely. Dobó leaned against what was left of the wall, chest heaving, armor cracked and bloodied. He stared at the valley, where Ottoman officers were already regrouping, already planning the next attack. And he whispered to himself, "We will endure. Even if it destroys us." Silence settled over Eger Castle after the Ottomans' failed breach, not a peaceful silence, but a heavy, suffocating quiet filled with exhaustion, blood, and disbelief. The sky above the shattered walls was thick with smoke. The air stank of gunpowder and burned timber. Broken weapons and bodies lay everywhere. Captain István Dobó leaned heavily against a cracked stone column, trying to catch his breath. His sword hung limp at his side. His armor was battered, his knuckles bleeding, and his right shoulder throbbed with a pain he refused to acknowledge. But the breach had been sealed. Barely. Desperately. Miraculously. Around him, defenders worked in a slow, dazed rhythm, lifting stones, stacking barrels, dragging wounded comrades out of piles of rubble. Their faces were streaked with soot. Their eyes were hollow, haunted by the memory of the explosion and the chaos that followed. Ferenc Sisi approached, limping, his leg bandaged with a torn piece of tunic. His voice was hoarse. "They're retreating to camp, Captain." Dobó nodded. "Only for now." He knew the truth, the Ottomans hadn't withdrawn out of fear. They were rearming. Reorganizing. The next assault would come. And when it did, the defenders might not even have the strength to stand, let alone fight. He turned to look at the breach. The makeshift barricade was uneven and shaky, a clumsy wall of crates, beams, stones, and broken cannons. But for now, it held. Dobó placed a hand on the rough wood. "We survived this because of heart," he whispered. "Nothing else." Around him, the fortress looked like a wounded titan, walls scarred, towers cracked, roofs burned, and the courtyard littered with debris. But the defenders, they still moved. They still breathed. They still existed. That was enough. For now. Over the next 3 days, the siege changed. The great storm of assaults paused. The cannon fire slowed. Ottoman officers paced their camp, studying maps, sending scouts. Their intention was clear: wear Eger down from within. The defenders felt the shift immediately. Food had become dangerously scarce. The storerooms, once stocked with grain and dried meat, were now nearly empty. Women rationed tiny portions, barely enough for a child to stay warm, let alone fuel a fighting man. "If we don't eat," one soldier muttered bitterly, "we'll die before their next attack." Dobó overheard him, but said nothing. He knew every man was thinking the same thing. Water supplies were strained as well. The well still functioned, but every day brought new debris from the bombardments that threatened to contaminate it. Buckets had to be filtered twice before the water was safe. And the weather. Autumn in northern Hungary was turning cold. Nights brought biting winds down from the mountains. Frost formed on the battlements. Fires had to be rationed to save fuel. Children shivered under thin blankets. Even hardened soldiers wrapped rags around their hands to keep their fingers from going numb. Winter was coming. And the Ottomans knew it. For them, winter was merely an inconvenience. They had supply caravans stretching miles behind them, bringing food, water, firewood, medicine, every necessity an army might require. For Eger, winter was a death sentence. But the defenders refused to admit it aloud. Dobó walked the walls each night, cloak pulled tight, boots crunching on frost. He checked every crack, every repair, every guard station. He paused often to peer into the valley where thousands of Ottoman campfires flickered like stars. They were watching. Waiting. Calculating. One night, as Dobó stood at the parapet, he heard a soft voice beside him. It was Eva Sisi, the widow who had carried supplies and tended wounds from the first day of the siege. "Captain," she said gently, "the people are afraid." "They have reason to be," Dobbo replied. "But fear is not defeat." She nodded. "They'll follow you, Captain. Until the end." Dobbo turned to her. "There must not be an end. Not for us." He didn't say the rest. If there is an end, it must be theirs. As days passed, the Ottomans unleashed a new tactic, psychological warfare. They lined up their prisoners, villagers captured from the countryside, and executed some of them within sight of the walls. They hoisted impaled corpses on stakes. They shouted threats and promises of mercy through amplified horns. Some defenders broke down crying. Others gripped their weapons until their knuckles turned white. Dobbo ordered the people to stay away from the southern wall during these displays. "You will not look at their terror," he told them. "You will not give them victory with your eyes." Inside the fortress, morale fluctuated wildly. Some days, hope flickered like a tiny flame. Other days, despair settled like fog. But whenever spirits sank too low, Gergely Bornemissza found ways to lift them. The young artillerymen crafted traps, primitive grenades, improvised rockets, containers filled with shards of metal. He worked tirelessly, experimenting with mixtures, laughing softly to himself as if the siege were a puzzle he intended to solve. His devices became legendary among the defenders. They called them Bornemissza's devils. And every soldier wanted one. Then, on the 12th day after the great storm, everything changed. Early morning frost sparkled on the ruined walls as defenders huddled near braziers for warmth. The air was quiet, too quiet. No cannon fire. No shouting. No drums. Ferenc Sisi rushed to Dobbo on the southern parapet, pointing toward the valley. "Captain," he whispered, "look." At first, Dobbo saw nothing unusual. Then he noticed the movement. Ottoman soldiers were gathering in a massive line stretching across the plain, the largest formation yet. Siege guns rolled into position. Janissaries assembled by the thousands. Their elite units moved toward the front. This was no ordinary attack. This was the decisive one. The defenders knew it. The Ottomans knew it. The air vibrated with tension. Then, like a thunderclap, the first cannon fired. The final phase of the siege had begun. Dobbo lifted his sword high. To the walls. The defenders surged into position. Below, the Ottoman army advanced. And Eger braced itself for the hardest day of its life. The ground trembled beneath Eger Castle as the Ottoman drums unleashed a thunderous rhythm that rolled across the valley like an earthquake. The sound shook dust from rooftops, rattled broken shutters, and sent waves of dread through the hearts of the exhausted defenders. This was no ordinary assault. Even the air felt different, heavier, charged with the weight of history. Captain István Dobó stood high on the southern bastion, wind whipping his cloak as he surveyed the valley. What he saw made his jaw tighten. The entire Ottoman host was advancing. Not thousands. Not tens of thousands. But the full strength of Ali Pasha's army, pouring forward in waves so dense they looked like a living tide. Siege guns rolled into place, their barrels aimed upward like the open mouths of dragons. Janissaries formed disciplined lines in the foreground. Behind them, the Sipahi cavalry gathered in massive, glittering formations. Auxiliaries, Azabs, Akinjis, irregular troops, lined the flanks, carrying ladders, hooks, shields, and rams. The valley floor had become a sea of metal, wood, and fury. Ferenc Sisi appeared beside Dobbo, cheeks pale. "Captain, it looks like half the world has come to kill us." "No," Dobó replied. It only feels that way. He paused. But it might be enough. Below, the defenders rushed into position, hobbling, limping, gripping weapons with blistered hands. Some had fresh bandages covering wounds from earlier battles. Others had no armor left and wrapped themselves in rags against the cold. Yet every one of them took their place on the wall. They knew what was coming. They knew this could be the day they died. But none stepped back. Because if this wall fell, the entire region would fall with it. And so, as frost glittered on broken stone, Eger prepared for its darkest hour. The assault began with a roar. All at once, Ottoman cannons erupted. The blast shook the earth so violently that several defenders lost their footing. Debris rained from the sky. A tower cracked open with a loud splitting sound. Wooden platforms splintered. A section of parapet collapsed entirely, sending 2 defenders plummeting into the courtyard below. Arrows followed the cannon barrage, thousands of them, darkening the sky like a plague of locusts. The arrows clattered against stone, shields, and armor, embedding themselves in the walls and walkways. Defenders ducked behind battlements, clutching shields made from patched scraps of wood and metal. Then came the rockets. Bright, flaming streaks cut across the sky, striking the fortress with explosive bursts that sent fire licking across rooftops. Fire crews. Dobó shouted. Sand buckets. Move! Even as flames rose on one tower, the Ottomans surged forward. Azabs charged first, shouting battle cries, shields raised, ladders at the ready. They sprinted across the open ground, stepping over the bodies of those who fell to arrows and gunshots before they could even reach the wall. The first ladders hit the battlements. Hooks slammed onto parapets. Ottoman soldiers climbed, snarling, stabbing upward with curved blades. The defenders responded with brutal efficiency. Spears thrust down. Boiling water poured. Stones crashed onto helmets. Axes swung to chop ladders in half. But for every ladder destroyed, 2 more rose. And then the Janissaries advanced. Clad in disciplined ranks, untouched by fear, they approached the wall with terrifying calm, pushing ahead under a shield screen. Their ladders were taller, sturdier. Their training unmatched. The true battle had begun. Dobó met them at the southern bastion. Steel clashed on steel. Blood splattered across frost-covered stone. War cries blended with screams. Ferenc Sisi fought beside him, parrying a strike while shouting orders to younger soldiers. A defender was hurled from the battlement by a Janissary's shield. Another collapsed, an arrow lodged in his throat. Yet the defenders held their line. Until the second wave hit. Ottoman sappers reached the weakened western wall, carrying a massive battering ram capped with iron. They swung it once, then twice, then a third time. Crack! The wall shuddered. Reinforce the west wall. Dobó shouted. But as he spoke, ladders rose on the opposite side. The enemy had chosen this moment, a moment of divided attention, to strike everywhere at once. Eger was being swallowed. Near the courtyard, Gergely Bornemissza sprinted with a satchel full of his homemade explosives. His face was smeared with soot, his hair matted with sweat. He reached the western wall just as the battering ram struck again. Another crack. A section of the wall began to crumble. Make space! Bornemissza yelled. The defenders stepped aside as he lit the fuse on one of his infamous devils, a small clay pot crammed with black powder, iron nails, and shards of metal. He hurled it through the gap at the ram crew. Kaboom! The explosion rocked the ram, sending Ottoman sappers flying backward in a spray of fire and dirt. The ram cracked in half. The enemy line staggered. But there was no time to celebrate. Because at that exact moment, the Ottomans launched their most terrifying tactic. The fire oxen. A herd of cattle, driven mad with fear and pain, charged toward the fortress gate, backs covered in burning bundles of pitch and resin. Their desperate bellows echoed across the valley as flames engulfed them. The Ottomans whipped them toward the gate with shrill cries. If the fire oxen reached the wooden gate, it would burn to ash. Dobó's eyes widened. Archers, bring them down. Arrows rained from the battlements, striking the animals. Several collapsed before reaching the gate. One crashed into the stonework and fell twitching. But a few made it to the base of the wall, igniting piles of debris. Flames licked upward. Smoke filled the courtyard. Water! Eva Sisi screamed as she led a team of women with buckets. But even as fires were fought, the walls were collapsing. Ottoman soldiers breached a small gap near the northern tower, and suddenly, defenders found themselves fighting hand-to-hand inside the fortress itself. The fighting was savage. Desperate. Hopeless. And yet, the defenders did not give an inch. Bornemissza hurled another bomb. Ferenc Sisi blocked a scimitar aimed for Dobó's throat. Eva helped drag a wounded defender out of harm's way before grabbing a fallen spear and thrusting it into an advancing enemy. Every moment felt like the last. Every breath tasted of dust and blood. And still, they fought. Then, miraculously, after hours of relentless combat, the Ottoman drums signaled retreat. The attackers fell back. Slowly. Unwillingly. Leaving hundreds of bodies along the slopes. The defenders slumped to the ground, barely conscious. Eger had survived the greatest storm yet. But they all knew. The siege was far from over. The Ottomans would come again. And next time, they would stop holding back. For a long time after the Ottomans withdrew, Eger Castle lay in a dreadful silence. The defenders slumped against blood-soaked stone, too tired even to speak. Their chests rose and fell in shallow, ragged breaths. Many stared blankly at nothing, their minds lost in the haze of exhaustion and trauma. The sun hung low, casting a weak amber glow over the battlefield. Smoke curled from splintered towers. Half-burned beams crackled softly. Wounded men moaned in the courtyard, calling for water, calling for help, calling for loved ones who would never answer again. Captain István Dobó walked among the fallen, his steps uneven, his breathing heavy. His armor was dented, his cloak torn, his face streaked with dried blood. Not all of it is. He stopped beside a young defender whose arm had been severed in the fighting. The boy's eyes fluttered weakly. "You held the line," Dobó whispered. The boy attempted a faint smile before unconsciousness claimed him. Ferenc Sisi joined his commander, leaning heavily on a broken spear like a crutch. His voice shook. "Captain, we aren't going to survive another attack like that." Dobó nodded slowly. "No. Not like that." He gazed toward the valley where the Ottomans reorganized, their campfires flickering to life as the sun dipped below the hills. They were already preparing. They always prepared. They had endless supplies. Endless men. Endless weapons. Eger had none of those. But what they did have was something the Ottomans could not measure. A will to endure. A hunger to survive. An unbreakable spirit. And in the coming days, that spirit would do something extraordinary. The next days were a blur of pain, urgency, and fear. The Ottomans resumed their bombardment, though not with the same intensity. Instead, they fired deliberately, testing weak points, keeping the defenders awake, wearing them down inch by inch. Inside the castle, food ran dangerously low. The cooks stretched thin supplies into thin oat gruel and watery soup. Hard bread was rationed to small chunks. Even children received only enough to keep them conscious. Winter crept closer. The first flakes of snow dusted the battlements one frigid morning, melting instantly against the warm stones but reminding everyone of what lay beyond the next horizon. The defenders' hands shook from hunger and cold. Their movements slowed. Their eyes sank deeper into their skulls. And all the while, the Ottomans watched. Ali Pasha understood precisely what starvation could accomplish. But amid the despair, a spark of hope emerged, born not of luck, but of genius. Gergely Bornemissza, the young artilleryman, refused to succumb to desperation. If the Ottomans could use fire, so could he. If the Ottomans could use explosions, so could he. And he would do it better. In a corner of the fortress, he gathered materials: pitch, sulfur, oil, iron scraps, linen, tar, anything he could salvage. He worked tirelessly, barely sleeping, sketching designs by torchlight as others brought him whatever scraps of metal or powder they could find. His hands were blistered. His face smudged with soot. His clothing singed. But his mind was unstoppable. "Captain," Bornemissza said one evening as Dobó approached, "we've lost too much to keep fighting as we have. So I say, let's burn them." Dobó raised an eyebrow. "Burn them how?" Bornemissza grinned, a dangerous, brilliant grin. "With this." He unveiled a large wooden cart fitted with sealed barrels, spiked wheels, and crude ignition devices. "What is it?" Dobó asked carefully. "A miracle, if God wills it," Bornemissza said. "An infernal machine." The opportunity came at dawn 3 days later. The Ottomans, confident from their near success in the last assault, pushed their siege trenches dangerously close to Eger's walls. Their engineers dug forward positions. Their artillery inched nearer. Their infantry lined up too close to the fortress, far closer than they should have. Bornemissza saw his moment. "Captain," he said urgently, "give me a team of 12 men. And a distraction." Dobó didn't hesitate. "You'll have 20. The plan took shape instantly. The defenders launched a small counterattack, fierce enough to draw Ottoman attention, not strong enough to overextend. Arrows rained down. Muskets cracked. Men shouted and taunted the enemy from the battlements. Meanwhile, Bornemissza and his team pushed the infernal machine to the edge of the wall. Below them, Ottoman trenches swarmed with soldiers preparing for the next assault. Bornemissza lit the fuse. "Push," he commanded. The defenders shoved the cart off the wall. For a moment, time froze. The cart tumbled downward, gathering speed, the fuse burning dangerously short. Then, kaboom! A massive explosion tore through the Ottoman forward trenches. Flames erupted in a brilliant orange wave. The blast overturned wooden shields, shattered rifles, sent bodies flying through the air. Burning tar splashed across soldiers, igniting clothing and equipment. The trench collapsed. Panic exploded among the Ottoman ranks. Defenders on the walls roared with triumph. It was the first time in weeks that hope surged instead of fear. Bornemissza, covered in soot and panting heavily, allowed himself a rare smile. Ferenc shouted, "Do you have more of those?" "One left," Bornemissza replied. "Do you want to use it wisely, or beautifully?" Dobó stepped forward. "We'll use it when it hurts them most." As the smoke cleared, something unexpected happened. The Ottomans hesitated. For the first time since the siege began, they pulled back, not out of strategy, but out of fear. A small shift. Barely noticeable. But real. And for Eger, even the smallest victory mattered. That night, the defenders ate their meager rations with a little more brightness in their eyes. They whispered about victory, even if only a small one. Children smiled again. Women hummed old songs. Men allowed themselves to believe that perhaps, just perhaps, they might live to see another sunrise. But Dobó knew better. Tomorrow, the Ottomans would return with vengeance. Tomorrow, they would unleash something terrible. And tomorrow, the true fate of Eger would be decided. Night descended on Eger with an icy hush, snowflakes drifting lazily across the black sky, melting as they touched the scorched stones of the fortress. The defenders huddled around small fires, warming trembling hands, sharing torn blankets and half rations of bread. For the first time in weeks, there was something like hope in their eyes, small, fragile, but unmistakable. Bornemisza's infernal machine had shattered the Ottoman forward trenches, killing dozens, injuring hundreds, and, more importantly, terrifying an army that had never before feared the defenders of Eger. Even in victory, however, the castle remained a wounded beast. Walls crumbled. Barracks burned. The stench of blood lingered in every corner. But the people were alive. Ferenc Sisi walked slowly along the battlements, lantern swaying in his hand. He stopped beside a soldier asleep standing upright, leaning against a parapet. "He's exhausted," Ferenc murmured to Dobó, gently shifting the man to a safer position on the ground. "Aren't we all?" Dobó replied. He stood on the southern bastion, staring out into the valley where the Ottoman camp still flickered with thousands of torches. Even after the fiery disaster in their trenches, the enemy remained vigilant. Officers barked orders. Engineers reassembled equipment. Cavalry units patrolled the perimeter. But something was different. Their movements were slower. Their drums quieter. Their formations less confident. The defenders felt it too. "The Empire bleeds," Dobó whispered to himself. "And they do not know how to bleed." The next morning dawned gray and bitterly cold. Frost lined the battlements, and the defenders breathed white clouds into the frigid air. The cannons did not fire. No arrows fell. No Ottoman infantry advanced. It was the first quiet morning in more than a month. At first, the defenders didn't trust it. They kept helmets on, shields ready, muskets loaded. Women carried water cautiously. Children whispered, afraid even to speak above a murmur. But the Ottomans remained still. Ali Pasha, furious over the losses caused by Bornemisza's firecart, convened his officers. Their scouts reported growing unrest among the soldiers. Supplies were running thin. Winter was tightening its grip. Their trenches were frozen. Their ammunition wet. Their morale shaky. "We cannot leave without taking Eger," one officer argued. "Then take it," Ali Pasha snapped. "No more delays." And so, the Ottoman commander prepared the final assault, an attack meant to break the will of both defenders and God himself. But Dobó was ready. Despite exhaustion, he walked every inch of the battlements, checking the patched walls, the improvised barricades, the shivering men trying to muster courage. He spoke to each one, brief words, but words that mattered. "Stand firm. We've beaten them before. The night is darkest before dawn. You are the shield of Hungary." Then he climbed the highest tower and looked out over the valley. Snow had begun falling again, fluttering gently across the landscape. It softened the battlefield scars, covering bloodstains, broken ladders, and burned trenches. It made the world look peaceful. But Dobó knew peace had not returned. Peace was waiting to be earned. And the earning would come with blood. That afternoon, Ottoman drums shattered the silence. Ferenc Sisi rushed to the bastion. "Captain, they're advancing." Dobó nodded grimly. "So it begins." Out in the valley, the Ottomans were assembling again, but this time, the formation was smaller. Not because they had fewer men, but because they were saving their strength for one decisive blow, a concentrated attack aimed at the last stable section of Eger's walls. A place Dobó had been preparing for. He turned to Bornemissza. "It's time for your last miracle." Bornemissza nodded. "The second fire card is ready." But this one was different, larger, reinforced, packed with metal shards, burning pitch, and barrels of oil. It was, in every sense of the word, a weapon born of desperation. Below, the Ottomans charged. Janissaries in the lead. Azabs on the flanks. Sappers carrying hooks and ladders. Archers firing upward in endless volleys. The sky turned black with arrows. The ground thundered with footsteps. The walls shook with impact after impact. Dobó shouted, "Defenders, hold the walls." The fortress erupted into chaos. Spears thrust downward. Blades clashed on stone. Men screamed as arrows pierced armor. The Ottoman columns reached the walls and began climbing. Ladders slammed into the parapets. Defenders fought violently, throwing rocks, stabbing downward, hacking at enemy hands. Yet the Ottomans kept coming. The weight of their numbers pushed Eger to the brink. Then Bornemissza struck. He lit the fuse on the second infernal machine. "For Eger!" he roared. The defenders pushed the fiery cart down a wooden chute built for this exact purpose. It tumbled, sparks flying, gathering speed until it slammed directly into the largest Ottoman assault column. A moment of silence. Then a blinding eruption. Cra-boom. A massive fireball tore through the siege line. Ladders shattered. Soldiers were thrown backward in burning waves. Tar ignited equipment. Oil splashed across ranks. Chaos exploded. The defenders roared, thunderous, desperate, triumphant. The Ottomans faltered for the first time in the final assault. The explosion broke the momentum. The Janissaries hesitated. The sappers faltered. The Azabs pulled away. And then, against the will of their commanders, the Ottoman lines began to retreat. Dobó didn't believe it at first. He stood frozen, sword dripping blood, watching as the great army pulled back step by step. Then Ferenc shouted, "They're retreating! They're retreating!" The defenders erupted in cheers so loud they echoed across the valley. Snow whirled in the air. Smoke curled upward. Broken ladders burned on the slopes. The mighty Ottoman army, after more than a month of fire, steel, and suffering, was leaving. Ali Pasha, humiliated and furious, ordered the retreat. His officers protested, but the truth was undeniable. Winter had arrived. Their trenches were frozen. Their supplies were low. Their morale shattered. And their dead lay in thousands upon the field. Eger had done the impossible. Eger had beaten an empire. As the sun set on that final day of siege, Dobó stood at the wall, surrounded by the wounded, the weary, and the unbroken. "You have saved Hungary," he said quietly. "And history will never forget you." Behind him, Bornemissza sank to the ground, exhausted but smiling. Eva Sisi cried softly, holding the hands of children who had survived. Ferenc leaned against the wall, staring at the emptying valley in wonder. An Eger castle, scarred, burned, battered, stood unfallen. And so, against all odds, against starvation, winter, flame, steel, and an army 20 times their size, Eger stood unbroken. A fortress held not by stone, but by courage. Not by cannons, but by conviction. Not by numbers, but by heart. The Ottoman Empire, undefeated across continents, withdrew from the walls they had promised to crush. Their siege machines were abandoned. Their trenches lay in ruins. Their soldiers left behind in defeat. And the defenders of Eger, farmers, priests, soldiers, children, widows, and blacksmiths, stood atop those battered walls and watched the greatest army in the world retreat into the distance. History remembers kings and empires. But Eger reminds us that sometimes history is changed by ordinary people who refuse to surrender. The courage shown here didn't just save a fortress. It didn't just save a town. It helped protect the very heart of Europe from collapsing into darkness. Eger is more than a story. It is a testament to the power of unity, sacrifice, and unbreakable will. And now, I want to hear your voice. What would you have done in their place? Do you think a stand like Eger could still happen today? Which moment of this siege struck you the most? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I read every one. If you found this story powerful, inspiring, or unforgettable, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who loves history as much as you do. It helps these stories reach more people and keeps history alive. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next chapter of the past.